I think that the way people manage their careers don't fit the way we talked about careers 10 years ago, but frankly is much smarter and much more productive because they're building a book of expertise in business that most companies today don't offer anymore. They don't offer those old rotational programs anymore. And so you get really pigeonholed inside of a team, inside of a job, inside of a company. And it's up to you to manage your own career and go find those ways to learn new skills and constantly kind of upskill yourself. And that's where I think freelancing comes in.
Went all in, play my cards right. Up the ante, won blackjack all night. Roll the dice, let it ride. Water the odds, I got snake eyes.
I worked for a large company, but I was on the sales side of things. But it was a big company, right? And got paid, you had the whole structure of a very large company, went to corporate events, all this kind of thing. I remember leaving and starting my own business. And early on, and for a while, and it still happens today, a question that I would get asked to me by a lot of people in corporate America, how many employees do you have? It was like, how much do you bench? And at the beginning, I didn't even know sometimes how to answer that question. It was just because I felt like they were measuring me. So it's like I knew the number of people, but I felt like I was being judged right off the bat. And I was like, this is weird. And so as I'm listening to you talk and reading about what you all do and how you help freelancers, you hear that type of question. I don't know if you've had that similar experience for yourself. And like, what is that? I mean, I know what it's about, right? There's the whole psychological thing to it. But when that comes up, like what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating question because it really gets at what you said, societal norms and expectations for what success looks like. And I think when you ask someone, how many employees do you have? It's sort of a proxy for, like, are you a real business?
Yeah.
And if you're a real business, then you have big numbers, you have big expenses, you have a big team that's working for you, and that the team equates to like, your ability to generate revenue, profit in a business. And I think that that's really been challenged and flipped on its head in the last 5 years. And you're going to see that dramatically changing right now that it requires so much less technology and so much less human capital to start a business. There isn't this requirement that you have all these full-time employees. And so there's a new version of that question.
Right.
That is a better proxy to like, is your business big? Is your business successful? That's probably more aligned with like revenue and profit because you can build incredibly valuable, profitable revenue generating businesses now with 0 employees, especially if you take advantage of the freelance economy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even in the revenue side of things, like you'll hear people talk about revenue, like what kind of revenue are we talking about? And they say, well, they made 25, my business partners, M&A guys, finance, they'll make $25 million, but they spent $26 million to get the 25. And then you'll talk to another company that made $1 million in revenue and they spent $100,000. So like, okay, so how are we defining success? How many people we have, how much revenue we brought in, how much we ended up making. And, I think a lot of this gets to the point of like purpose. Do you enjoy what you do every day? Are you going to come, you're 40, 50, 70 years old later on and you're like, what have I been doing? I've been selling my time to go work in a large office. And I should have taken this plunge years ago. I don't know, right? Like there's just so many ways to look at it. Don't you see?
I think the definition of success has really changed a lot. And that's what this ultimately comes down to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And all of those were just old world proxies of figuring out what success meant, right? You don't want to ask someone, do you have a big house? Are you happy? Are you fulfilled? Do you have a nice car? So you ask, how many employees do you have or how much revenue do you have? But there's so many different ways to get to a thriving professional career. There's so many ways to build wealth. And in fact, more and more, the traditional path is the slow path, is the unreliable path. And so this kind of rise of the solopreneur or rise of the portfolio career, which is a new term that I hear a lot of people using, where your goal is to build a portfolio of value, whether that's in your personal brand, in your expertise, and collect those revenue streams. And it's never been easier to do that, right? It's never been easier to start a podcast or, create a new revenue stream. That, of course, it's not easy.
Right.
For it to be successful. It's easy to start. It's not easy to scale it and have it be successful. But I think the overarching idea that it used to be viewed as, people look down on you if you freelanced. It was kind of this
Yep.
idea of you're a starving artist, or you can't hack it in corporate America if you're a consultant, or those that can't do teach. All of those adages, I mean, they were true a few years ago. I mean, when I left my, 15 plus corporate career and kind of dropped the mic at my last role, at Facebook, I was a senior executive and I wore that as a badge of honor at dinner parties. And fast forward
Hmm.
6 months later, and I was a part time product consultant making more per hour than I was making in my fancy corporate job. But there was this sense of like, ooh, like, can I tell people that? Does that sound impressive anymore? And 3 or 4 years ago, it didn't sound impressive. Now it's all the rage. Now everyone's a fractional head of something and they're teaching a course on the side and they've got a podcast on the side. And those are things
Right.
that you can't afford to do and don't have time to do and don't own your own IP to do when you work for a company. But you're starting to see that now as being the new badge of success is this ownership. Do you have an
Yeah.
LLC? That's now viewed as the exciting thing to talk about a cocktail party. And so that's a huge shift that's only really happened in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, that badge of honor you wore at dinner parties, like for you to say that out loud right now, and you've obviously said this before, that's some deep stuff. That's like recognizing, like, what was I saying at these dinner parties possibly? And who was I? Who was I pretending to be? And I'm projecting now these thoughts. And I'm not saying it went to that point, but that's a big thing because you can go to a dinner party and you can hear someone talking, and that's great. And no judgment, right? Everyone has a choice to do what they want to do. And I've told people that thought they wanted to start a company, and then you hear them talk about it. And perhaps the answer is to stay where you are, but make that decision and hopefully you can get happy wherever that might be. And there's nothing wrong with working at a company. I mean, we've had employees here that wanted to go into the small business, but eventually wanted to go back and work for a very large company, very defined role in what they do. But for you to show up at that dinner party and then to think that some years later, that's a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think I learned tremendously and gained a lot of value working for big companies and big institutions. But there is a part of it that you sort of start to inherit their value, right? You project their value or their cachet onto yourself. So you're not just Angie and Eric, you're Angie who worked at Facebook and Angie who worked at Visa. And if those brands are viewed as desirable and represent success and intelligence, then a little bit of that bleeds onto you. I mean, that's just how the world works. So it's impossible to escape that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that because people don't have a ton of time to get to know you. So everyone's going to look for proxies. Everyone's going to look for a way to kind of categorize you in their mind. I think what happened though is we became too attached to those proxies and those labels. And at least for me, I viewed those as the symbol that I was successful, that my work had paid off, that I was intelligent until I didn't, until I realized that I was putting more value on the brand of the company I worked for than on actually the work product itself. And I talk about this all the time. When I left my last corporate role, I was managing, millions of dollars of budgets and had dozens and up to 100 people reporting to me. But that first year when I was consulting and the last 3 years as I've been building Groovy Money, I've been the most creative I've been in my entire career.
Yeah.
I've produced the most, what I think of like real net new value to the world. And that should be my measure of success, right?
Yeah. Yeah. How's that feel, right? Like being the most creative you've ever been. Because I look at it that if I'm able to do something creative, if I'm having this conversation with you, which I'm doing, I enjoy this more than a lot of other things. And when we've helped people build podcasts, build platforms, write blogs, whatever the creative endeavor that they're going, maybe it's building a business, I can see it in that thing that they're building is the best thing that they do, that the most enjoyment they get out of it. They don't maybe see it on the front end, but once it starts happening and once they start realizing, you're like, wow, because then it makes the mundane work perhaps understandable. Like, okay, I have to do this because then I get to do these other things. And I think that's a big part of it. Do you feel that way the more creative that you've become in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think the creativity and the ability to generate value is directly associated with, a few things. Like one is like psychological safety. Do you feel like you're in an environment that it's safe for you to take risks? Being creative requires taking risks. And so you've got to have, set yourself up. And some of that comes to finances, and finances can be a big blocker for people in taking risks in their career and pursuing things that put them in a state of flow that really allow them to like use their gifts. I think being creative means you actually tap into and know what you're good at. And not everybody knows that off the bat, right? A lot of people sort of craft themselves into what they think is a really desirable skill set. But over time, and I got lucky after having a very lucrative corporate career that I started to see the pattern of like, oh, turns out like I'm getting promoted, my work's getting recognized, and I'm having fun. This is a clue that this is when I'm in my zone. This is the type of thing that allows me to be creative. So creativity is something different for every person. One person's creative is going to be being an incredibly talented bookkeeper. Another person's creativity is going to be being able to design and build something beautiful. And then another person's creativity is going to be their strategic mind and how they're able to see business opportunities that other people don't see. I think the key is being able to hone into yourself, and that requires space and time to really listen to yourself. We talked about an environment that kind of rewards you for that and doesn't just kind of push you into a very narrow zone. And I think you need to have a village of people who are willing to do the things that you're not good at, to really prop you up and support you. And that's what's been both the biggest challenge and also where I've seen some of the most exciting progress as I've pursued this entrepreneurial lifestyle is figuring that out, leaning into it, giving myself grace to make mistakes and fail, but also just like make sure you're constantly reassessing those things so that you don't end up back on that whatever path you were trying to escape from when you walked out of the 9 to 5 life.
Yeah. Well, because those questions, the one that I asked earlier, could lead someone to think, well, I better go scale up my business and I better hire W-2 employees to work at my company. So when I answer that question the next time, I can say a real number definitively, get that wow moment. Like that's tough for a lot of people because you're talking about building a company. You can build a company with no employees, right? They can be freelancers. And there's a lot in that. And that's a lot what you all are building. And it's changed because you can do multiple things. So that individual freelancer could work basically for multiple different companies. And they could have their own, let's say, podcast or product or whatever, consulting, whatever word you want to use for that on the side as well. So they have multiple things going on. There's a couple of things. I'm going to stop there with the label of it. So when now they ask, what do you do? That's a very difficult question to answer, right? And for us, sometimes it's easier. Let's say, okay, we help people build podcasts. They might do a search for podcast production companies in Charlotte. Okay, cool. We'll come up. And then now they know they came to us for something specific. If we have an insurance brokerage business, if we do this and if we do that, none of that stuff matters to that individual. They came for that specific thing. And for them, it's very easy to define what we do and what we can do for them, right? The problem becomes when you're talking to someone, you're like, well, what do you do? And if this person does 7 different things, how are they supposed to label that? And that's complicated in the freelance world, especially like, let's say you went to Stanford, right? You worked for Microsoft, you did all of these things. Do you see what I'm getting at, right? Like it becomes complicated to even have that conversation because you possibly do so many things. Like maybe you're talented in bookkeeping, maybe you're talented in creating content at the same time. Maybe you're this and maybe you're that, and you live in Charleston and you're part of this board, you're part of the community. Yeah, you get
I mean, I think that it becomes even more important than to understand what's your so what. Like, what's your personal mission statement? What's the thread that's tying everything together? So I'll take an example. One of our customers at Ruby Money is named Tiffany, and she worked at a huge PR firm for many, many years and had Fortune 100 customers, companies, and brands as clients. She decided to leave all of that and become a coach. And so she was a business coach. But then she recognized that her calling wasn't just business coaching, it was coaching other women. And not just coaching other women, but coaching women to start creative businesses. So then she was a creative business coach, but then she launched a podcast and she started hosting retreats to allow women to better understand their goal and visions. Then she launched a community where she was providing group coaching. Now she's a speaker. She speaks around the country on everything from building your own personal branding to launching a business. Now, it could be tempting or confusing for her to say, I'm a coach, I run retreats, I'm a public speaker, I run courses. But those are the tactics. Ultimately, if you level all of that up, what she does is she helps women build businesses that they love, and she helps women step into their power. And so if you can create a narrative that ties everything together, right? So for me, my narrative and everything I do is all about leveraging technology to help people achieve their goals in life. So whether that was me building banking products at Capital One or helping creators at Instagram monetize their content, or now at Ruby Money, helping freelancers do their taxes, ultimately, I'm a builder. And the thing that I get passionate about building is tools that enable people to be entrepreneurs and grow their wealth. And that thread, everyone is going to have a thread like that. And so the mission or the problem you're solving becomes what you tell the story. I'm a connector, I'm a builder, I'm a creator. And then the tools, oh, well, I worked for this company for 3 years doing this. Then I wrote a book about doing this. Then I teach a class about doing this. And I run a podcast about doing this, right? And you can sort of see the portfolio build out from there.
Yeah, I get it. Okay, very cool. So to the employee piece of it, so you have a company, Ruby Money. Are you employees? Are they freelancers, people that work with you, for you, consult with you?
Yeah, it's a mix of both. So I really wanted to not take advantage of, that's the wrong way.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I really wanted to build a company that deeply understood the market that we were serving. And I wanted the people who were building Ruby Money to deeply understand the experience of a solopreneur and a freelancer. And I fundamentally believe that the smartest way to build a company right now is to go find the people that are the most talented at what they do and give them the space to do that. And very rarely can you do that in a full-time role, because you usually end up taking on a bunch of stuff that's outside of your zone of genius. So we've had over 30 freelancers and consultants and solopreneurs help us build Ruby Money over the last couple of years. And each of those is incredibly good at doing one specific thing that we needed. And as you build a company, what you need changes every 3 months, every 6 months. One quarter you're focused on building out a new feature. The next quarter you're focused on marketing. The next quarter is, oh my goodness, you have a bunch of customers and now you have to help them be successful and provide customer support. And so we've built out our team very nimbly based on what we need. So, I'm really the only person, along with me and my co-founding engineer, who have been there from the very beginning. And the rest of the team we've flexed and brought in along the way to kind of help us build based on what the business needed at that time. That has some pros and some cons, but ultimately I believe it's the smartest way to build a business today.
Yeah, we've done both. And the mistake that I've seen at other companies, and when I would look at that to say, for example, if they're doing social media, they would go find the person that was the closest, although still very far, to social media. Now congratulations, you're now the social media manager. And they're like, wait, what? I don't know anything about Facebook. I hate Facebook. I don't want to be on Facebook. And yet now I'm in charge of social media. And you can see the culture breakdown as a result of those things because they're not doing the thing that they're best at. We've hired and we've had success and we've had misses. And I blame myself for these things, bringing somebody on and trying to find a spot for them because possibly I like them. They're really good at one thing, or I don't know. There's just some dynamic there. Like, this is someone that I could talk to, but it becomes complicated. When you find someone who's very good at this specific thing, it becomes much easier, kind of like you said. So to hear you talk about that coming from where you came from, I think that applies to a lot of people that at our company, the people that we talk to, the people that listen to the show, to better understand how to build your business and the world that we live in.
Yeah. I think it can be incredibly valuable to have, you need one person who's the vision holder, and they can see, they know the past, they know the present, and they're charting the future, and they can kind of hold that vision steady and constant. For some organization, that needs to be more than one person, right? I'm building a tech company, so it would be challenging to have to jump from, and build a new engineering team and try to rebuild that institutional knowledge every time we wanted to add a new feature. And so if you look at what is the core capability of the business you're building and how do you make sure that there's a permanent kind of institution that can keep that core capability and make it best of class. And then for everything else, like you said, like how do you bring in people who are excellent at that thing at the time that you need it? And yeah, avoid that idea of trying to empire build or, oh, I really like this person. They knocked it out of the park on this marketing campaign. Now I'm going to go see how they do at sales, or now I'm going to go see how they do at customer support. Sometimes that works, and you should definitely give people that opportunity. But I think it's more likely that that person would benefit from going to find another client who they could knock it out of the park and going really deep and coming an expert in that one thing. And maybe the best thing you can do for their career is provide an amazing testimonial and help them find their next client rather than trying to like push a square peg into a round hole.
One more thing on this topic. One thing that's being taught at school is when you get your job, start looking for your next job, right? So you're getting resumes and you see people, they've worked for 5 companies, 10 companies, and it depends on how many years. It's very different, right? I remember my mom's like, well, you can't change companies again because you've only been there for this amount of time. Eventually you got to stick. And there's truth to that. And there's also like, no, you're trying to find your place. So I get it from all different sides, but that's complicated. So when you hire someone, got the person, maybe you figured it out. 1 year later, they're 6 months later, they're already gone and you've seeded so much into them. But I'm sure every company deals with that. I'm sure you've dealt with that in your experience before. It's like, oh, you finally found the right person and off they go. And you're like, oh, geez, like, what's that all about? So I think that's the difficult thing that a lot of companies that we've worked with have dealt with.
Yeah, I think that's hard. I think that's something that I've struggled with is sort of the onboarding time frame and what it takes to bring someone into the company and make sure that they're productive if you know that they may not be there for a long period of time. And I know when I've worked for big organizations, I would have people tell me, oh, like it'll take you 2 or 3 years before you have any influence or able to get anything done, can find your way to the bathroom, those sort of like put in your time. I just don't think that's the way the world works anymore. And so you have to figure out how you can generate value quickly and how you can keep your scope and your aperture small enough that you don't fall into that trap. And also build a culture that allows that for your team. If you bring someone on and you need 6 months to train them, and then 6 months later, they bolt and go to another job, then that's going to be really challenging. So that's something that I've had to really focus on because you're right, that was a departure for how I hired and retained talent, in my bigger company jobs. Is like, how do I scope this role? How do I scope onboarding? And how do I support this person knowing that they may not be here for a long time and that's not a bad thing? That doesn't mean that that's not a negative thing if they leave and move on. Like that's a great thing. And that's something that I want to support them in doing. I do think there's a cost both to an organization and today's talent if you are jumping around too much without like a clear tie between what you're doing. So if one day you're a fitness podcaster and the next day you're a social media manager and then 3 days later you're a real estate agent and then you're a TikTok creator, I'm not sure that type of bouncing, unless you're specifically on a discovery mission, right? Which that's what your 20s are for. Go for it.
Sure.
But at some point, I think there's a difference between that and staying at Google for 26 years, right? And I think you can say, hey, I really want to be an amazing marketer. And to be an amazing marketer, I'm going to spend 18 months in 6 different institutions so that I understand what B2B marketing looks like, what consumer marketing looks like, what product marketing looks like, what growth marketing looks like. And then maybe I start to realize that, oh, it's really growth marketing that I love, or it's really content that I love. And then you start to narrow in onto that and you bounce around to get different experiences and work your way up the ladder and bring your previous knowledge into the house. And so I think that the way people manage their careers don't fit the way we talked about careers 10 years ago, but frankly is much smarter and much more productive because they're building a book of expertise in business that most companies today don't offer anymore. They don't offer those old rotational programs anymore. And so you get really pigeonholed inside of a team, inside of a job, inside of a company. And it's up to you to manage your own career and go find those ways to learn new skills and constantly kind of upskill yourself. And that's where I think freelancing comes in. So many of our members have a full-time job. They have a W-2 job and they are building independent income on the side, either in something that they're super gifted in that they don't get to flex as much in their full-time role anymore, or with an eye on eventually leaving that full-time role and becoming a full-time consultant or contractor, or in the thing that's new. that their current role isn't giving them permission to do. And so it kind of comes back to this idea of a portfolio career. And I think a recent stat showed that 80% of Gen Z, the kids that are kind of graduating college right now, expect to earn some form of self-employment income in addition or in exchange of traditional institutional employment. I think they've lost trust in traditional institutions. The recent layoffs have made it very clear that there isn't security. So they're trying to figure out, how do I bet on myself? And I think this question of like, when everyone is a business, you're a business, I'm a business, we're all a business. And whether you're, making $150 a month on an Etsy store, $20,000 a month as an operations consultant, or several $1,000,000 as a famous content creator or entrepreneur, we're all businesses now. And the reason I started Ruby Money was because no one taught us how to be a business. There was no class in high school. And for most of us, no class in college unless you majored in accounting or finance for what, like, literally the definitional responsibilities are running a business and how to approach your finances, how to approach your taxes. And with that being the norm, with everyone being their own business, then it's going to be increasingly important that people come into that and have tools and communities that sort of educate them and automate all of the different responsibilities that exist in America for business owners.
Yeah. And the thing is, none of it's guaranteed. So even if you go work at Google or one of these companies, you mentioned the word before, laid off. And if you've never been laid off before, it's real. It happened. I've been laid off. I was at a company. I was on a vacation. I was early on in my career, so didn't have much of an impact. I didn't have kids at the time. Came back and I knew things were changing. A new CEO they just hired from Morgan Stanley. I was at AXA at the time. And he wanted to change things up. And he eliminated the entire division on a Friday afternoon. Again, I was in Mexico, came back, had 3 weird voicemails. And my wife's early married said, go to the office, see what happens. There's security waiting for me. Went to my desk. They grab your stops. Can I get on my computer and pull some? No. You're leaving now. And that's it. And they were all gone. They kept a skeleton crew of 4 people and they were eliminated like 3 weeks later. And that's life, right? So people's like, well, no, I need the guarantee. There is no guarantee. Like just because, they can lay you off tomorrow and they don't care. And again, it's not to say that don't go work at a large company, but this stuff changes. So you can speak to this. You went to Stanford. You worked at some of the largest companies in the world. Did you study finance in college?
I did. Yeah. I majored in finance.
Okay. So you go down this path. And so a lot of people like, if you're going to go to Duke, if you're going to go to Stanford, if you're going to one of these schools, and you have to go work at one of the large tech companies, one of the large banks, accounting firms. Nowadays, like you just said, kids are coming out and they have different expectations of what they want to do, but they've also just paid. I mean, as you've seen, college prices are just at another level. Like, how do we balance all that?
Yeah. So you were sharing your laid off story.
Yeah.
So I went to Stanford for business school. I went to my local state college for undergrad on a full federal scholarship. And so kind of came out pretty unscathed.
Mm-hmm.
And then decided, oh no, I should go get into a bunch of debt and go to Ivy grad school.
Right.
And I don't regret the decision. It was a fantastic investment. But when I came out of Stanford for grad school, I didn't go to a big secure company. I went to a teeny tiny 20-person venture funded consumer technology startup because that's what you do when you're in Silicon Valley. And I was very eager to be, I think even back then I knew what type of environment I was going to thrive in. And I wanted to be at the small company. And 4 months in, got laid off. The company recognized they weren't going to be able to raise another round of funding. They got acquired by a larger conglomerate and laid off basically anyone who wasn't required to keep the lights on. And I remember that feeling of like shame and embarrassment of like, I just invested in this Ivy League degree and took on all of this debt to get laid off. And so I don't think it matters where you go to school or how much you invest in your education. Like the real world is the real world and the real world doesn't play fair. And so I think going into any of these investments you make in your education, one, understanding what the long-term goal is. Is your goal to build your network? Is your goal to learn and develop yourself? Is your goal to get a very specific job and just have a very clear understanding of what you're going to get out of that and that there's no guarantees and not putting yourself in a position that's going to backfire. But I think also just taking a long look at that. I mean, ultimately, that 4-month experience didn't work out, but the founder of that company made an introduction to another entrepreneur, and I joined their company where I stayed for 5 years and ended up having a successful exit. I didn't make millions of dollars, but enough that it helped me pay off my student loans. And then that experience of working for two early stage tech startups put me in a position where I was very desirable to go work at a large Fortune 100 company. And I went and worked at Capital One and brought the technology expertise that I had gotten, the scrappiness that I had learned. And so taking that long view is incredibly important, and not just making decisions thinking just one step ahead. Because otherwise, I would have never had made those investments in building my technology resume, knowing what I knew about how many startups fail. So it's a very personal decision.
Sure. When you were at Capital One, you got these different companies at Instagram, and I'm not sure if you were hiring, but you knew the people that were hiring or however that worked. How much did the brand of the university matter in the hiring process?
Yes, it was different. So I built teams at all the company I was at. And it was funny, the startup that I was at for 5 years prior to going to Capital One, when you're a startup, you can't access the best talent in the world necessarily because you can't always pay the most. So you have to recruit very differently. And I think we created a very distinct culture there that attracted people who wanted to buy into that culture. And a lot of times those people were the best and the brightest, but they just weren't attracted to big corporate culture. So we were able to attract really, really intelligent and talented people without necessarily having the big brands. I think when I was at Instagram, very much there was a bias to certain universities, there were a bias to certain backgrounds, but you tap out pretty quickly when you do that. And then you still need to hire. I mean, we had thousands of positions open when I was working at Facebook. And so you have to find other ways to assess talent and culture fit. And so we had developed, and we did this at Capital One as well, we developed an interview process that we felt tried to strip out some of the biases that came from looking at where you went to college or what your last job was, and really focus on like the latent intellectual curiosity and skill set that you had. And particularly at Capital One, that worked incredibly well because being in Washington, D.C. and being a bank, we weren't a very desirable employer at the time when we were building our tech team. And so we had to shake the trees. We had to look for needles in haystacks, but we also need to keep the talent bar really high. And so if you've got thousands of people applying with very non-traditional backgrounds and you can't just use the school they went to or the degree they got as a qualifying factor to get them through to the next round, you have to be more creative. And, we developed case studies and homework assignments and live interviews and all these fun ways that we use to try to create real world opportunities for people to share their brilliance with us without needing to rely on these institutional labels and proxies. And I worked with, just the smartest, most creative, most talented, most kindest, most humble people I ever worked with during my time at Capital One, potentially even more so than my time at Facebook, when in theory you can recruit, you can have the cream of the crop, but sometimes those biases create adverse selection.
Yeah. So now you're talking, so we could say we're talking to Mike. I have 3 kids. My 2 youngest are daughters, right? And as they're coming up and they're interested in their academic and they want to study, they're looking at, as they start to look at universities, let's say, the word advice comes up, but what would you give them to think about? And it's not just my kids, it's just anyone that's out there. What would you give them to think about today I feel like you have a great background to talk on these topics, if that makes sense, from what you've done and what you're doing today, especially with, kids are going to be graduating from Boston University or Harvard or wherever, and they're going to go start a company and they're going to go start a podcast. And it's like parents and grandparents will be like, what are you doing? You can't do that. Anyway, with all of that said, because I do think there's a ton of value in going to work for a startup or going to work for a Microsoft or Capital One, Citi or whoever, what would you give them to think about?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I have 2 daughters. They're 7 and 9. So this is real. I need to give them advice.
Yes, let's do it.
So I think it's a few things. One thing I've learned the last few years, and I think is sort of a non-negotiable for anyone who wants to build a career, is figuring out and owning your personal branding and figuring out what are the things that you want to be known for and starting to talk early and often about those things. And so that doesn't mean you have to be a TikTok creator, but what is the medium that you want to share? Is it written? Is it video? Is it audio? and right. I think creating and building based on what's authentic and curious and interesting to you is the way that you're going to attract people into your world who want to work with you. And I don't think that's something that we had to do in the past. And I think that's something that is incredibly important. And so, this idea of creation and creating without a strong filter in terms of perfectionism, but the filter being like what's authentically curious to you. And so, if you're 18 and what you're really into is horses, write about horses. Then when you're 21, what you're really into is something different. Write about that, talk about that, build a community around that. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is I think the skill that's going to be most rewarded in addition to creativity is problem solving, like learning how to learn and learning how to solve problems that you've never solved before. It kind of goes back to this parenting advice that you get about building a growth mindset. It's no longer going to be with the advance of AI and how quickly technology, it's not going to be like, do you know how to code in this language? Do you know how to build content for this platform? And getting trained up on that one specific thing and becoming a master at it. The new skill that's going to be rewarded is learning how to learn and being really comfortable being uncomfortable and being able to leverage, the new social dynamics, the new technology, the new communities to kind of help yourself and others kind of adapt in that world. So I think that is a really important. So looking for institutions and programs that allow you to do that and aren't about kind of the old pedagogy of education of like, here you go, study this manual and take this test, but where you're sort of starting with a blank sheet of paper. There's classes now, all these amazing online schools where, in 6 weeks you launch a business, or in 6 weeks you learn how to compose a song and publish it on Apple Music and earn royalties in Bitcoin. I mean, there's all these amazing things where you're actually producing value and learning. So that's my second one, is just learn how to learn and get really comfortable being uncomfortable. And then the third skill, ultimately, when technology is stripped away, we're people. And so the third skill is going to be around really understanding how to form genuine human connections and develop empathy for people in the world. I still believe that the best products, the best companies are formed from an insight that's grounded in extreme empathy. There's some amazing stories from the Stanford Design School and some of the design firms they've worked with, like IDEO, that talk about these amazing scientific breakthroughs that came from an insight a dad had studying, a son with cancer going through an MRI machine and really empathizing with that experience. And then that led to building this like massive $1 billion medical device business. And I think ultimately with screens and technology and robots and all of the things that keep us away from humans, nothing is going to replace the ability to fully, deeply empathize with someone's emotional needs and see them in their shoes and use that as the inspiration for connection, for building, for seeing ideas that other people don't see.
Yeah. It's funny. My daughter, the school she goes to, and she's in a robotics class, and she's shown this genuine interest in ChatGPT, right? And GPTs in general. So the teacher is taking her off the typical task and is letting her build her own GPT and just trying it out. It doesn't matter whether it works or doesn't work or what path they go down. Those are the types of things that, man, like you could be 12 years old and learn how to do that type of stuff. And it's not easy. I get it. And so we need to bring it to multiple different places and all communities. And like you said, those platforms, there's people who can build those things. And so I think it's super important that everyone's thinking about it, not just kids, but parents, grandparents, schools, the educators are all learning about it as well. I want to touch on two main topics going forward from here for this conversation: Facebook, Instagram, social media, and then get into AI aspect of it and Ruby Money and all that. Those are two big of the last 15 years or however many years it's been, social media and then AI. But social media, they're just like, we can go watch what's going on at Capitol Hill and the issues that are coming up, right, as a result of mental health and all that. You worked at one of these companies. You're here today. You have two young girls. Like, what are you thinking about when it comes to social media? You know more than most because you've worked there. And I don't know exactly specifically the things that you did there, but here's the thing. I don't know how you all found our podcast, and you could go to Apple and all these things, but a lot of times you can connect with someone through social media, and it's amazing. The relationships you can form through social media and the connections and finding your tribe and all that stuff is amazing. On the other end of it, these are extremes. It's super toxic, and kids have committed suicide as a result of that. At the same time, the kids have committed suicide for other reasons as well. Terrible thing that's going on. But from a social media standpoint and the responsibility of these companies, like what comes to mind for you when I start talking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an incredibly important topic, and I don't think we're going to know for many, many years, like what the ultimate impact of social media is on us as like a humankind. But I think in a lot of ways, it's been more damaging than helpful. And I think people talk about social media as, the new sugar as the new cigarette. And there's a reason that you align those things together. And it's for two things. One, like there's good and there's bad, right? Like we love birthday cakes. We love being able to celebrate with a cookie or a sweet drink, but then we know and ultimately in excess, they're not healthy for us. And I think social media is the same. It fundamentally changes your brain chemistry in ways that we didn't realize in the very beginning. And in most ways that are not healthy, particularly if you're young. But even as an adult, I mean, how many people do you know have been like, I'm deleting Instagram from my phone for the month of January because I can't control myself? Or, after spending time on Twitter, I'm angry at my wife, because the world is just so blah. And so I think there's not much debate, at least that I've seen, about how harmful social media can be to us as humans. I think the big question is like, it's not going anywhere. And so, what is the way that we protect ourselves from it? What are the ways we limit? And when I worked there, there's these equal forces, right? There's the money making force that is, they need people to continue using the product to grow profits, to create shareholder value, which for the most part, most of us own shares in these social media companies if we have invested in the market in any way. On the flip side, there were incredibly passionate teams of people inside these divisions, 30, 40, 50, hundreds of people whose entire goals were removing these destructive forces and really trying to understand what was causing them and whether it's protecting teens or protecting bullying. And so I don't believe there's like necessarily all good or all evil, but I think we know enough now that the responsibility is on you as an individual and on you as a parent. We can't wait around for government. We can't wait around for the world to stop being greedy and the stock markets to stop going up and governors and lawmakers to step in and regulate. It took, what did it take, 50, 60 years for us to get a label on a pack of cigarettes? And so we've still got some time,
Right.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
So it's incumbent on all of us to use our own kind of knowledge. And so, I mean, my kids don't come anywhere close to social media and they're still under the age of 10. And so how I navigate that when they become teenagers and that becomes, a part of their life is still something I need to figure out. But even as an adult, I spent a lot of time thinking about how do I not let myself be negatively harmed by these platforms, because they are a requirement in some ways to grow a business. If you're not present on LinkedIn, if you're not present on Instagram, how do you build community? How do you get your message out there? But at the same time, if it's 10:30 at night and you're checking your LinkedIn likes and seeing how many new followers you got, that might not be the best thing for your brain at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were probably, I don't know if you were at Facebook during when the Social Dilemma, the documentary came out, right? That raised a lot of people's like, oh, wow, this is happening. And this had been going on. And so you could have figured that stuff out. But when it's in that kind of style of a documentary with the music and the storylines and all that kind of stuff, it's very eye opening. I don't know what reactions were at the time. And maybe it created like teams to say, we need to fix this or we need to work on it, let's say.
Yeah, I think that came out after I was there.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the safety teams, I mean, there's thousands of people working on
Yeah, that's good.
on safety and spam and trolls at these companies, thousands and thousands of people.
Right.
Ultimately, though, you can't control everything about these platforms, just like you can't control human nature, right? You can have as many police as you want.
Right.
There's still a risk that something's going to happen to you on a street on any given day. And so what do? You move to safer neighborhoods. You don't stay out late. You carry around
Right.
pepper spray. And don't get me wrong, I am not providing any sort of like forgiveness or amnesty on these institutions. I think it's 100% their responsibility to figure out how to make their platform safe. But ultimately, you can't wait around for that.
Right.
You have to take accountability yourself to keep yourself safe and to keep your children safe. And now that we have this knowledge, now that we have this data about how much harm these platforms can cause, you have to act personally on it. And I just don't we didn't
Yeah.
have that data 10, 15 years ago, and that's a shame, but now we do. And so,
Yeah. Yeah. People have personal accountability, responsibility, no different than like let's say they didn't offer finance classes or they didn't teach you how to create content at school. Fair enough. And you spend a lot of your time there. So what do you have left in your hours in the day? At the same point, if you want to learn finance, you can learn, especially this day and age, like you can learn it, right? You don't need school to teach it to you. I get it. That takes some self-motivation to do it. So it's very difficult. No different than taking accountability in your own hands to figure out, okay, at this hour, I need to turn this off or I need to become aware. I think there's a ton of awareness that has to take place. And that's not easy. I think a lot of people just don't have that. It is what it is.
and you need to reward organizations as a society who do take that into account, right? The way that they're making decisions isn't just what's going to generate the most profit, but what's going to generate the most overall planetary well-building, whether it's ESG or climate change, all of those things like have to be rewarded. And right now in the fintech world, there's a lot of companies that are building to try to help people improve their financial wellness, help them get out of debt, help them make smarter decisions. Those companies, frankly, for the most part, face an uphill battle because it's so much easier to sell people another loan, so much more profitable to give people, oh, I'll give you your money 5 days early. I'll give you a discount on this thing, whether it's an installment loan or any of these things that ultimately allow us to consume more because Americans are addicted to consumption. And so it's harder to build a business that ultimately helps people. And so the creative entrepreneurs that are doing that, they have to have stamina, they have to have patient, healthy investors, and they have to find ways to make it good for everybody. And that can be challenging to do.
Yeah. So social media has this rapid climb, right? It's super important, super embedded into our culture. AI's, been going on and we've been using it in some capacity. And I don't think people even realized how involved they were with it without even knowing it. But now we're at this point, ChatGPT was kind of like the game changer, right? And it opened up people's eyes and used the word automation at Ruby Money, right? And that's super important. When I started building this business, one of the things to talk about, you have to automate. You have to build things so you don't have to continue to repeat the task by yourself. And you get into accounting, like one of the least favorite things that people have to do when they run a business, an LLC, an S Corp, all those things. AI had this incredibly rapid rise and it's only going to go get bigger. And we're going to find companies like Ruby Money out there. What did you see to say, I need to go down this path? I want a business in that. I mean, I'm sure we talked about a lot of these things already as it related to having your own thing that you're building, but then to attach it to automation, AI.
Yeah. Well, first, just to set the stage, I should explain a little bit about what Ruby Money is. So we're a smart accounting platform for solo service providers, freelancers, people who work for themselves, and we automate the mundane tasks of keeping track of your income, identifying your expenses, finding tax write-offs, and ultimately paying your taxes to the IRS. So when we started that, I looked at all of the things that solopreneurs had to do manually and all of the things that they were trying to find a human service provider to do for them, an accountant, a bookkeeper, the questions they were asking, the tasks they wanted to get done. And in a lot of cases, the tasks that they weren't doing because having those conversations were uncomfortable or because the services were prohibitively expensive. And we talked about this shift from having employees to being a solopreneur. And it used to be you had a business, you had a bunch of employees, and you had a bookkeeper, right? And your bookkeeper, ran payroll and she organized all of your expenses and she ran your books every month. And then you had an accountant and your accountant prepared your taxes for you. And you had this like series of people who provided, human support to your business. Well, with the invention of machine learning and AI and being in the mobile phone, most of these services can be done for you without a human. And in fact, can be done better than a human could do them because they can learn from themselves. They can analyze, our app will analyze millions of transactions. And so can very easily know, oh, this is a write-off, or this is income, or this isn't a write-off, or this isn't income. And you could take advantage of that kind of machine intelligence to use a term you used earlier, buy back your time. and, save money because you don't have to go hire a bookkeeper. Bookkeepers are $300, $400, $500 a month, and most of them onboard you onto a very expensive accounting platform like QuickBooks or Xero that only they know how to use. And then they spend 1 or 2 hours every month reconciling your books and sending you a report that you likely never open. But you feel that that's something that you should do. That feels like the responsible thing to do. And so what we found was people were either just not doing it or getting overcharged for it and buying something that was more than what they needed, but didn't actually help them run their business. And so leveraging these, AI, leveraging automation, it allowed us to deliver a very targeted solution to a very specific person and say, this is what you need. You need a product that does these 4 things with you. Like what you're most interested in is keeping track of your expenses, making sure that you're paying your quarterly taxes on time, and keeping your profits high as a solo business owner. And so everything that we've built leverages the technology that these massive tools use, that these humans use, but democratize it, make it accessible incredibly cheaply. Half of our product is free. The other half is $20 a month. Like, less than the cost of a fancy salad if you live in a medium-sized city.
Right.
And so it really, there's no reason to not have everything you need at your fingertips to feel confident about your finances, to stay on top of your taxes, to avoid those penalties, maximize your write-offs. And these are words and topics that used to be reserved for millionaires, right? Millionaires had tax teams. Normal people just, good luck. You can't take advantage of the tax code. You can't take advantage of anything that's available to you because you can't afford to buy that expertise. And so really making that type of expertise available, leveraging technology so that everyone has an opportunity to take advantage of the strategies and the data that's available to lower your taxes, that just became really core to our mission. And I think lines up with the opportunities that you're seeing with things like ChatGPT, with things like automation. You're just fundamentally lowering the costs and increasing the access so that more people have the same foundation to build off of.
Yeah, I think they're more inclined to use the word accessibility. We use that all the time, making it accessible to do these things. So you're helping people take that step because there are things that will stop people from doing it. They will not start a business because they just don't want to deal with the accounting of it. And it's scary. I mean, just to get on the Secretary of State and figure those things out and file there's so many little things that have to be done when you have your own business that will stop someone from doing it. We talk about all the time.
Oh, I've had people tell us that they have spent 2 hours trying to pay their taxes, their quarterly taxes, and gave up because they literally couldn't figure out how to pay. And so if you can automate that, I mean, with a click of a button, we handle all of that, right? It's like the Amazon one click, right? Behind that one click is billions of dollars of complexity, but they've abstracted it away to one click. And so what's the easy button? And I think payroll companies at big companies have done this, right? They make it so that your taxes are taken out automatically. You contribute 3, 4, 5% to your 401k. All of that is handled magically. They create these default nudges.
Yeah.
Automations. If you don't opt out of this, I'm going to do this on your behalf. And that's how you trick people into making smart decisions. And so I joke that a lot of what we're doing is taking that day where you're really motivated to get on top of your finances and you're like, I'm going to get ahead. I'm going to set aside every time I get a client invoice, I'm going to set aside 20% for taxes and I'm going to put 10% away for retirement and I'm going to make that quarterly tax payment. I take that energy and that positive intent you have that moment, and then I systematize it so that for the rest of the year, you get the benefit of that. So now every time, a client pays an invoice, it says, hey, Eric, you got paid today. I've set aside $200 for taxes. You're on track to make your quarterly tax payment this quarter. Or, hey, Eric, I saw you purchased a laptop. $300 of that is a write-off. I've gone ahead and put that on your tax report for you. And so you shouldn't have to have that will, have that determination, have that positive intent every moment of every day. That would be very draining,
Yeah.
You need to do it once, and then you need to find systems and automations that can act on your behalf. And that's really what we built, because that doesn't exist for small business owners. You have to go hire a human who every month is like, hey, Eric, would you like to pay your vendors? Would you like to pay your taxes? Would you like to run your payroll? And you're like, oh, I guess so.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. So I want to take time away from everything else I'm doing, like you just said. Yeah,
I
absolutely.
want to log into my bank account. Where's my password?
Ugh,
Do the two-factor,
right. It's stressful too. I mean, it's that whole thing of you're just watching it happen. And for some reason, like it just brings your energy down. We talked about being creative. I think that gives you energy. It's still exhausting, but in a good way. It's like working out, perhaps, where it's just draining. I don't see, unless you're super into that type of thing, which very few people are, I think it's way more draining and takes away from everything else that you do during the day, during the week, when you go home at night with your family. Like, I get it. That's why when we're deciding like who do we want to talk to, and we see an organization like what you're creating at Ruby Money, like that's who we want to talk to. It even allows someone to think about what industry do you want to get into. Maybe someone loves accounting. Okay, so what aspect do you want to be a CPA? Or do you want to get with a tech company? Do you want to learn like how can you apply your insights and your special knowledge to a company like that, as opposed to being the one that's like going to get all frustrated because Ruby Money's taking my clients? No, like you can still be a part of this. Just because AI came and it can write and it can create code and it can do math, like that doesn't mean that you're out of a job. It can be if you just refuse to learn about it. So
yeah, totally agree.
yeah, this is awesome. Where do we learn about Ruby Money? What do we learn about you, Angie?
Yeah. So rubymoney.us, www.rubymoney.us is our website where you can create an account, get started. It takes less than 5 minutes. You just connect your bank accounts and boom, right? You have a 24/7 accountant working for you. It's incredibly powerful and incredibly easy to use. And we just redesigned. So it's now even prettier than it used to be. I do a lot of writing on LinkedIn. You can follow me, Angie Moody, on LinkedIn. I write a lot about my experience as an entrepreneur. I wrote a lot about being in fintech as a woman. I write a lot about the solopreneur life and tax tips and things you can do to build a profitable, thriving solo business owner. Eric, I think our team created a special code for your users. If anybody wants to sign up, we have a free plan, but we also have a plus plan. And if anyone uses the code entrepreneur, when they sign up for the app, they'll get 50% off a first month of our plus plan. So I'm sure Eric can put a link in the show notes. But yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the show. I think it's really important to demystify some of the things that can keep people from taking the entrepreneurial leap, as well as talk a little bit about kind of the shifts that we're seeing in entrepreneurship. And this, I think you and I covered a lot of it, but I think it's really fascinating and it's really encouraging. And so I hope that your listeners see this as an opportunity and hopefully a trigger to try something new.
Absolutely. Angie, thank you so much. This is great. I've enjoyed our conversation. We've gone over an hour, but thank you for your time.
No problem, Eric. It was great.
In case you haven't noticed, we love podcasts. In fact, we love building podcasts, everything from development to production. Because of all that, we're building a one-of-a-kind podcast network. If you have a podcast or looking to launch a new podcast, then we should talk. You can message me on Twitter at Eric_Kaz or hit us up any way that works for you. Let's talk about your podcast joining this one-of-a-kind podcast network.